children, my children, where are you? My children, my children, come to me.
That night, the Mexican sky looked gloomy. Thick clouds hung in the sky, covering the moonlight. The wind blew gently, carrying the damp aroma of the river that flowed along the small village. The sound of gurgling water was the only thing that could be heard in the silent night, as if whispering about a dark secret hidden on the riverbank. In a simple hut on the edge of the village, there lived a young woman named Maria. Maria was a woman known for her beauty, her long black hair flowing down her back, her dark eyes burning with life. However, behind her enchanting appearance, Maria's heart was shrouded in darkness. Maria once had a beautiful life. She married a rich man, a merchant from the city who fell in love with her when he first saw her beautiful face. Their life seems perfect. Her husband gave her wealth, luxury, and 2 beautiful children. However, what initially seems like a life full of love slowly turns into a nightmare.
How could things end like this? In the past, I was everything to him. But now, he is outside the house more often. I'm no longer important. These kids, they just remind me of a life I thought would never return.
Maria began to lose closeness to her husband, the man who once adored her. She began to notice signs that couldn't be ignored. Her husband was traveling more and more, spending time away from home, and whispers in the neighborhood suggested that he was interested in another, younger woman. Jealousy, hurt, and anger began to burn Maria's heart. Her children, who should be a source of happiness, instead become a reminder of how neglected she feels. Maria began to look at them with a strange hatred, as if they were an obstacle between her and her former happiness. One dark afternoon, when the wind was blowing stronger than usual, Maria decided to take a path she had never thought possible, a decision that would destroy her life and curse her soul forever. With a mind filled with anger and sadness, Maria took the hands of her 2 young children and led them to the quiet riverside. There, under the gray sky and cold water, he stood in front of the river, staring deeply into the calmly flowing water.
If I can't have happiness, if I can't have it, then no one can. Nobody.
With eyes filled with madness, Maria grabbed her 2 children and drowned them in the cold river. The children screamed and cried, begging, but Maria had already lost her mind. His once soft hands now turned into rock hard, pressing them into the water. In an instant, the children's screams disappeared, replaced by an eerie silence. As the river flowed slowly, Maria fell silent. His consciousness returned, and he stared blankly at the water. The silence that engulfed the night felt so heavy. The realization of what he had just done hit him like a sudden storm. His cold heart began to feel the coldness of the sin he had just committed.
My children, my children, what have I done? Come back. Please come back.
Maria ran along the riverbank, tears streaming down her beautiful but pained face. She tries to search for the bodies of her children who were swept away, hoping to pull them back from the river current that now claims them. However, the river had swallowed them completely. With her heart broken, Maria screamed loudly at the sky. However, the answer he received was only the sound of water and the night wind that seemed to mock him. The fatal mistake he made cannot be reversed. He has lost everything.
They are gone. I have killed them.
In unbearable despair, Maria jumped into the river, hoping to end her life and join her children in death. However, a crueler fate awaits. Instead of finding peace in death, Mary was cursed. He becomes an uneasy spirit, lost in the world between life and death, looking for his lost children. That night, Maria never returned. However, the villagers began to hear crying sounds on the riverbank. Anguished screams and heart-wrenching wails echoed across the water, shaking anyone who heard them. They knew Maria had become La Llorona, a wailing female spirit searching for her forever lost children in a dark river. Years pass, but the legend of La Llorona continues to haunt the small village in Mexico. Villagers who live near rivers now know very well that evenings by the river are no longer just a quiet time. They were careful, especially as night fell and the cold wind blew, bringing a familiar sound. The anguished cry of a woman who had lost everything. La Llorona, the cursed woman, appeared every time night fell, walking along the riverbank with slow steps, her tattered white dress soaked, as if constantly touched by the river water. Her long black hair was always wet, hanging wildly over her face. And amidst the silence of the night, there was a terrible wail that made anyone who heard it feel the hair on their necks stand up. One cold and silent night, in a remote village in Mexico, Diego and his sister, Lupita, were awakened by a disturbing sound.
Lupita, did you hear that?
Yes, that's crying, Diego. That came from the river.
The crying sound was gentle at first, like the wind blowing through the trees. But as time went on, the clearer it became. The cries turned into heartbreaking screams of sadness.
That's La Llorona, right?
They looked at each other with scared faces. The legend of La Llorona, the woman who wept for her children by the river, has long haunted their village. Tonight, they heard that voice was more real than just folklore.
We have to hide, Diego. He's looking for his children. We could be victims.
Calm down, Lupita. We have to stay calm. Let's look from the window first.
With careful steps, Diego and Lupita walked to the window. From there, they saw a white figure standing by the river, her dress glistening in the moonlight, her hair long and black, her face covered in shadow.
That's it, Diego. La Llorona.
The figure slowly raised its head, and although its face couldn't be seen clearly, Diego could feel the cold gaze piercing through them. Suddenly, La Llorona started to move, walking slowly toward them. Her crying became louder.
My children, come back to me.
We have to go now. Don't let him see us.
Diego grabbed Lupita's hand, and they ran out of the room toward the living room. Their hearts were beating fast, but outside, La Llorona's voice was getting closer, her cries piercing into their hearts.
Diego, he's approaching. What should we do?
We have to hide. Under the table. Come quickly.
They hid under the table, trying to hold their breath. La Llorona's footsteps began to be heard outside the house. The sound of her dress sweeping the ground became clearer.
Where are my children? I'm looking for them.
The cries grew closer, as if La Llorona was searching for something or someone in their house.
I can hear her. Lupita. She's outside the door.
Just when they thought it was all over, a knock was heard on the front door. A slow knock, weak but full of threat.
My children, open the door.
Don't, Diego. Don't let him in.
We won't move. Stay quiet. Don't make a sound.
Suddenly, the crying stopped. Silence hung in the air. Diego and Lupita looked at each other, thinking maybe it was all over.
Maybe he's gone.
However, before they could feel relieved, there was the sound of footsteps inside the house. In the hallway, right outside their room, Diego could feel his blood running cold. The bedroom door opened slowly, and the footsteps stopped.
He's here. Diego. He's in.
The two of them remained silent, their bodies shaking violently. La Llorona, with her dress strewn across the floor, stepped slowly into the center of the room, her cries sounding like whimpers of deep anguish. Suddenly, the sound of his crying became very loud. The two of them remained silent, their bodies shaking violently. La Llorona, with her dress strewn across the floor, stepped slowly into the center of the room, her cries sounding like whimpers of deep anguish. Suddenly, the sound of his crying became very loud.
Where are my children?
Diego and Lupita held their breath, hoping the spirit would go away. But La Llorona's figure was now standing in the doorway, looking into the room where they were hiding. Darkness shrouded his face, but Diego could feel his blank gaze piercing through them.
Why are you hiding from your mother?
Diego finally dared to come out of hiding, standing in front of La Llorona, even though his body was shaking violently. He knew this was the only way to stop it all.
We are not your children. They're gone. You can't take us with you.
La Llorona stopped, her face looking at Diego. Her crying subsided, but the sadness in her eyes seemed infinite. He stepped back, slowly fading into the shadows of the night.
My children! My children!
As dawn began to appear, the cries faded, disappearing with the mist. La Llorona was gone for the night, but Diego and Lupita know that he will return, looking for his lost children, condemned to cry by the river for eternity.
Come on, Lupita. We have to get out of here.
The night ended, but La Llorona's terror never truly ended. Every night in this village, people can still hear the sad cries in the distance, calling from the dark world, searching for something that will never return. La Llorona is still searching. And who will be the next victim? Diego and Lupita sat in silence on the verge of dawn, their bodies still shaking after what had just happened. What they thought would be an ordinary night turns into a living nightmare. Even though La Llorona was gone, the fear she'd left behind still gripped their hearts.
He'll be back, Diego. I know it. He always comes back.
I know. But we have to get out of here before he comes back again. We can't stay here any longer.
With hasty steps, they began to pack the things they could carry. Outside, sunlight began to shine into the village, but the morning light that was supposed to bring relief instead felt cold and eerie. They knew the horrors they faced that night were not truly over.
You think he'll follow us wherever we go?
I don't know, but we have to try. We can't stay in a place where he knows we are.
With a small bag in hand, Diego and Lupita left their house, walking through the quiet village streets. In every corner, La Llorona's shadow seems to lurk. Every sound of the wind blowing, every rustling of the leaves, made them think that the crying would return. After walking far away from the village, they arrived at the nearest town. However, the calm they hoped for never came. On the streets of the city, whispers about La Llorona could be heard. Some residents spoke in fearful tones, claiming to have heard the cries of La Llorona around the river that runs through the town.
We can't really run from him. He's everywhere. Every river, every village, he would always search.
So, we're never safe, huh? He will be looking for his children forever, and we could be the next victims.
Night began to fall again. Dark shadows crept along the riverbank. Diego and Lupita, although tired and full of fear, have no choice but to survive. Faint crying began to be heard from a distance. It was a sign that La Llorona was still searching.
We have to keep moving. We can't stop.
And as night fell, the sound of La Llorona's cries returned to haunt the air. No one knows when the cursed spirit will stop or who will be its next victim. One thing is certain. Anyone who hears La Llorona's cry will never forget it. They would always feel him approaching, waiting in the darkness to pull them into his cold embrace. On quiet nights, when the air is cold and quiet, be careful if you hear crying, because perhaps La Llorona is looking for you, and no one can escape her cries. Diego and Lupita continued to run throughout the night, crossing the forest and river they encountered in a nearby town. However, the further they went, the clearer it became that La Llorona was inevitable. Every time they felt safe, the cries came back, closer, more heartbreaking, calling names they couldn't hear clearly, as if calling for their children.
We can't keep running. He will always find us.
No, we have to try.
Suddenly, through the mist, footsteps were heard on the water. Diego and Lupita froze, not daring to turn around. But the sound was getting closer, and La Llorona's cries came again, closer than before. This time, it wasn't just a cry, but a heart-rending cry.
We are not your children. They're gone.
La Llorona approached, the river water swirling around her feet. Lupita screamed, her body shaking with fear. Diego stood in front of him, trying to protect his little brother, but he knew there was nowhere else to run. La Llorona is too close.
They're gone. You have to let them go. Let them go.
La Llorona's crying stopped suddenly. He looked at Diego with eyes full of pain, as if understanding a painful truth. For a moment, the sadness was so evident on his face. He realized that his children were indeed gone forever. In a hoarse and sorrowful voice, he whispered, with a final anguished scream, La Llorona turned, stepped into the river, and slowly disappeared into the mist, drowning in the rushing current. That night, Diego and Lupita stood by the river, watching her figure disappear into silence. Silence filled the air, and for the first time there were no more sounds of crying.
Is he gone?
Maybe he can finally find peace.
Dawn was starting to break, and the fog was slowly fading. Even though La Llorona was gone, they knew that her spirit would always lurk in lonely places along dark rivers. Her crying may have stopped for the night, but there was no telling when or where she would return to look for her lost children. For now, Diego and Lupita are safe. However, somewhere in this world, La Llorona still roams, cursed to cry all night long, searching for those who have been lost, and whoever hears her cry may never be able to escape her.